Hi, welcome to Premium Builds, I'm John. I'm wearing my blue t-shirt, so that must mean it's an Intel day. In this video we're going to take a look at Intel's 12th generation CPUs, in particular the i7-12700K, which we've got here for test. We're going to put it up against the Ryzen 5800X, the i9-11900K and the i9-10850K, Intel's outgoing flagships, to see how it stands up to them. Intel have been lagging behind AMD in the high-end CPU market for a while now, at least a couple of generations. The 11th generation failed to push the game forwards, and certainly the flagship 11th generation CPUs weren't a good option. And the last really decent CPU they released, the 10900K and the 10850K, are now 18 months old and showing their age a little bit. To address this, Intel have redesigned the 12th gen architecture from the ground up. It's been a long time in the making. It's now on the 10 nanometer production process, and it uses a hybrid architecture of both large performance cores and smaller, more efficient efficiency cores. So, for example, the i7-12700K that we're releasing now has 8 performance cores with multi-threading, so that's 16 logical cores there, plus an additional 4 efficiency cores that can be brought to bear on multi-threaded tasks. This design philosophy apes the kind of design we've seen in mobile chip architectures for a long time now, where you sometimes want very efficient cores, but it's still to be proven in the desktop environment where it actually brings advantages to the consumer. In total then, this CPU has 12 physical cores, there's 25 megabytes of level 3 cache, and it has Intel's UHD 770 graphics on board as well. The K specification means that on a Z690 motherboard, such as we're testing it with, it's also an overclockable CPU with unlocked multipliers, and you can tweak voltage and things like that to make the CPU perform to your preference. This generation of CPUs, and the 12700K in particular then, are vital for Intel to re-establish their authority in the enthusiast CPU market. So let's get straight into the testing and find out what it can do. For our test setup, we ran this CPU in the MSI Tomahawk Z690 motherboard. It's a mid-range motherboard that we felt would be representative of the kind of quality and feature set that most users would want to pair with this CPU. We also tested it with 16 gigabytes of 3600 MHz CL16 RAM from G-Skill. Again, a very popular kit, but also consistent with the testing we've done on all the other CPUs, so that we can be sure it's not RAM differences that are making the difference to performance, rather than the CPU itself. We ran it with an 860 watt platinum power supply, and the bulk of our testing was done with a Noctua NHD15S cooler, although we also validated some testing with the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 240mm AIO to see whether that style of cooler might be better suited. The GPU we used throughout testing was the EVGA RTX 3080 XC3 Ultra. It's again the standardized GPU we've used for all of this testing, and you'll find throughout our tests that we're testing at 1080p high settings, and that's because we want to expose CPU performance differences, which we do in our testing, but we don't want to overstate them in unrealistic scenarios. We want to give you a more realistic appraisal of the actual differences you might encounter in these CPUs and their performance, particularly in gaming. The synthetic testing, of course, we separate out CPU performance, so that's all you're seeing, and it's to give you a raw impression of the actual performance of the CPU itself. The testing we did on the 10th and 11th generation i9 CPUs we've done on an Asus ROG Maximus Hero 13 Z590 motherboard. And the Ryzen 5800X testing we did was done on an MSI Mortar B550M, a motherboard that we validated and tested against a number of other B550 motherboards, and we know that the performance is on a par on that motherboard. In short, each of these CPUs are on a platform designed to exploit the full potential of the CPU, to give you representative numbers, and we've standardized things like GPU and RAM speeds so that you can be sure it's differences in the actual CPU performance that we're seeing. Let's jump in first of all and look at some synthetic testing. Cinebench R20 is a test of single and multi-core performance whilst rendering a scene. It's almost entirely independent of memory speed, which allows us to isolate raw CPU performance. The i7-12700K clearly brings its core advantage to this test, with 12 physical cores overwhelming the 10 cores of the 10850K. Running a single core test demonstrates the performance of the single P core. The score of 737 points is a clear 100 points above that of the other 3 CPUs under test. Our main regret here is not having a 12-core 5900X available for test. No doubt that it would be a much closer run battle here in the multi-core test, although we know that Ryzen Zen 3 cores are in fact slower than the older late cores from this test, as you can see from that single core score. Moving on to another rendering test, we used Blender to render out a couple of scenes using the CPU alone. Again, this utilizes all cores to their full potential and gives us an indication of the raw horsepower of the CPU under full load. Note that shorter bars are better, indicating less time taken. In this test we can see that for the classroom render, the i7-12700K is a full 100 seconds faster to complete this workload than the next fastest CPU, the Ryzen 5800X. In the shorter BMW 27 test, The Alder Lake CPU is 30 seconds faster than the second fastest CPU, the i9-10850K. We feel obliged to point out using this test that rendering of this nature is always far better done on a GPU. Particular NVIDIA GPUs using the optics renderer in Blender are significantly faster than any of these CPUs, and in fact any consumer CPU you can buy. So this is purely as a test of CPU performance, and if you're looking to build a system for Blender or 3D work, these results aren't necessarily indicative of the CPU you should choose. You should allocate more budget to a GPU because that will get you better results. Nevertheless, looking at these results, we can again see that the actual power of the 12700K is pretty immense, and it's using those cores and those fast cores to its advantage to get this workload done quicker than anything else we've tested. Moving on then to gaming-oriented testing, 3D Mark offers a range of tests that are demonstrative of CPU workloads during gaming. Focusing in on the CPU component of the Firestrike and TimeSpy benchmarks, these tests do bring memory performance into play somewhat, and also heavily favour higher core counts as it's a parallel test that uses all cores. The i7-12700K stamps its authority on these tests as well, making significant gains over every other CPU on test. We can see it's scoring 8,000 points above the next best CPU in Firestrike, and it's around 2,000 to 3,000 points ahead of all the other CPUs in the TimeSpy test as well. Moving on then to actual game benchmarks, we've run these tests at 1080p and high settings to isolate CPU performance, but also to demonstrate in a realistic sense the actual difference you might experience between these CPUs, particularly if you're looking for high FPS gameplay or looking to push the CPU to its limits. Rainbow Six Siege has an inbuilt benchmark that we've found very consistent. In this benchmark, the 12700K turns the synthetic performance results into tangible performance gains, with 80 frames per second more than the 5800X and more than 100 frames per second more than the Intel 10th and 11th generation CPUs. Doom Eternal is also a really well optimised title, and again we're testing actual gameplay here in 1080p to demonstrate the differences in these CPUs. Initially, this test showed that the Ryzen 5800X beat the 12700K by a small amount, which is an interesting result given the apparent single-core advantage of the Intel CPU. Looking into this a little bit more showed that Doom Eternal is one of the games that Windows 11 struggles with on Alder Lake, so a switch back to Windows 10 and a retest showed the 12700K improving to the tune of 10 frames per second average. At 380 FPS, the performance is no slouch on either CPU, but the 8-core Zen 3 CPU still holds its own here. This result also highlights the challenges of a brand new platform being tested on a brand new operating system. Performance refinements will continue as operating systems mature and better allocate tasks on this complex CPU. Moving on to some more demanding AAA titles, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a complex DirectX 12 game that's representative of modern AAA titles. It's got a very consistent inbuilt benchmark that lets us look under the hood and show differences in actual CPU performance. It's those numbers we're looking at here to completely isolate it from GPU performance, and for that reason please note these are not the output rendered frames, this is actually the CPU's rate of running the game engine to have a look at how it's doing under the hood. This test swings back to the 12700K's favour with a clear 40 frames per second average over the other CPUs. Moving on to another AAA title, Red Dead Redemption 2 is another strong showing for the 5800X. It's surprising to see that it's matching the 12700K here with just a few frames per second to the new CPU's favour. It's quite possible that in this test, because it is so graphically advanced, even the RTX 3080 at 1080p ultra settings, we're finding the limits of the GPU here. Whilst lower settings might show wider gaps, we think it's more interesting to demonstrate how closely these CPUs will actually perform in real-world systems. If, for example, you find a cut-price 5800X and want to build a great value gaming system, you can see that you're not going to lose out on much performance in titles like this. To double check, we also ran this test in Windows 10 on both processors and found that it's not the OS holding back the CPU in this instance, like in Doom Eternal. Unfortunately, they've removed the game mode that we used to conduct our testing in Call of Duty Warzone. This has invalidated our previous results and means that we now need to re-establish our benchmarks across a range of processors for that title to get meaningful results for you. In the meantime, we've added two other titles to make up for it. They are Forza Horizon 5 and Far Cry 6. Far Cry 6 shows clear performance lead for the 12700K. It posts a 30 frames per second average higher result than the 5800X and blows the other CPU out of the water as well, the 10850K. The average low is even higher than the other CPU's overall average frames per second. You can see that this CPU excels in this game, providing a marked uplift in performance. And again, Forza Horizon 5 provides an in-depth benchmarking system and allows us to peek under the hood at the numbers that the actual game engine is running on the CPU, isolating it from GPU performance. And this title is one that actually can become CPU limited on, for example, Ryzen 3000 series CPUs. It's starting to approach the limit where if you've got a powerful GPU and you want to run at around 100 frames a second, you will actually start to get some stutter induced because the single core speed of those Ryzen CPUs is no longer fast enough to keep up with a GPU. Here we can see that the game simulation engine is running at 363 frames per second average on the 12700K, compared to an average of 328 frames per second on the 5800X and 280 frames per second on the i9-10850K. In the benchmark results, this translates to an average frames per second of 177 frames per second for the 12700K versus 163 frames per second for the 5800X and 155 frames per second for the i9-10850K. This is a substantial lead for the 12700K in this title. And finally, in our game testing, we've got Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Of all the titles here, this is the one that is most CPU bound and the one that stands most to gain from a very high performance processor. This benchmark comprises a 3-minute flight from LaGuardia over Manhattan and delivers a stern test of the CPU. GPU utilization stays under 70% here, and performance is ultimately dependent on CPU speed. We've omitted the i9-11900K here, as recent game updates have invalidated older testing with that CPU, but suffice to say it doesn't outperform either the 5800X or the 10850K in this title. Here, the 12700K is again the best performing CPU on test, using that spectacular single core speed to deliver 107 frames per second average. This test is all about cache size and core speed, and the 12700K has both in spades. We've got tons more in-depth analysis of this game, we've run a huge amount of benchmarking on it, including with this processor, and we will make a future video running right into the depth of how to build the best possible PC for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. So if this sim is your focus or you're looking to build a PC to excel in that, you'll want to keep an eye out for our content. Please do like and subscribe and you'll get that notification when the video goes live. However, as a quick spoiler, the 12700K is the absolute best bang for buck CPU to run this simulator right now. It gets fantastic performance across the board, and whilst the i9-12900K will perform slightly better, mainly due to larger cache size and a very slightly higher boost clock, it's just not worth the additional $200. You're getting a huge amount of performance with the 12700K in a $400 CPU. So the overall result here for gaming is clear. The 12700K beats everything that we've tested, and at $400 it's the best CPU you can purchase. Let's take a quick look at memory. Memory speed scaling is a big issue with Intel CPUs, and in particular with this new 12th generation, you've also got the choice between DDR4 and DDR5 RAM. Unfortunately, like most of the world, we can't actually get hold of DDR5 RAM at a reasonable price for testing at the moment, although we do actually have a DDR5 motherboard ready in case we are able to get some, and we can bring you some results on that. And actually, if you look at some other benchmarking where they've tested DDR4 versus DDR5, there aren't clear-cut performance benefits for DDR5, except in some very specific memory bandwidth intensive tasks. For gaming, DDR4 still appears to be the correct option for this, and we suspect that the vast majority of users on this generation will choose DDR4 memory. It's cheap, it's available, and it doesn't harm the performance of the CPU any. So let's take a quick look at RAM speed scaling on the 12th generation Intel CPUs. To investigate this, we used the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark again and scaled through various RAM speed options. You can see our results in this graph. These tests cover the spectrum from getting it wrong with default JADEC specification RAM, such as you would encounter if you failed to set XMP, through to commonly available kits at 3200 MHz and 3600 MHz CL16, up to overclocked and somewhat optimized DDR4 RAM at 4000 MHz CL15, 16, 16, 32 in Gear 1. You can see that there's relatively consistent performance scaling as RAM latency decreases, but it's not dramatic. We use Shadow of the Tomb Raider for this demonstration because it's very responsive to RAM tweaking, and many situations are not. Nonetheless, we can see that with a relatively affordable 3600 MHz CL16 RAM kit set to XMP, we have the bulk of performance on offer with minimal investment in both time and money. It remains our pick for the best RAM option for a high-performance Intel CPU into the 12th generation. There are also some 4000 MHz CL18 kits available at good prices at the moment, and they would also be a good option. We have separate content coming expanding on this aspect of CPU performance to help you choose the best RAM to pair with the Alder Lake 12th gen CPUs. So like and subscribe if you're finding this video useful, and you'll be able to see that content too when we deliver it. Let's take a little look at power and thermal performance of this CPU. Power draw and the consequent heat that generates have been a problem for Intel for a couple of generations now, as they've pushed their aging architectures to keep up with AMD. However, this is a completely new design, so let's take a look at it and see how it does. We ran our tests using the popular NHD15S cooler to examine the performance of a top-tier air cooling solution on this i7 CPU, and we also tested an Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 240mm AIO to see if they're adequate as well. This CPU maintains the Intel standard standard of 190 watts PL1 for the duration of this test as defined by the motherboard. Core speeds remain at 4.7 GHz throughout, and it didn't throttle even with an extended 10-minute test. CPU temperature is maintained at a thoroughly manageable 79 degrees Celsius. We repeated this test with the 240mm AIO and obtained the same results. Both coolers were plenty capable of handling the CPU at default settings. If you do intend on overclocking this i7 CPU, we'd recommend starting with a 280mm or 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler. That said, with the coolers we tested on it and under stock conditions, both the NHD15 and the 240mm AIO were more than capable of handling the heat output of this CPU without any detriment to performance. That's a pleasing result, particularly given the insane power draws and temperatures that resulted when you started to push the outgoing flagship CPUs to their limits. So if you're considering this CPU, what's it best suited for? Well, we've seen it's got very strong performance in both productivity and in gaming benchmarks. There's no doubt that it excels in either of those tasks. Indeed, at the price point, it's a very versatile and strong CPU. And it's really hard to say that there's any CPU that you'd be better off choosing at the $400 price point, regardless of what you intend on doing with it. It's the sweet spot for high-end gaming, content creation, video production, and that sort of task. Whilst Ryzen 9 CPUs do still offer more core count, with 12 and 16 physical cores on the 5900X and the 5950X, and a little bit more cache as well, their performance benefits aren't really made out. There are actually very few tasks that most people do regularly that fully utilise high core count systems. And when the 5900X is $550 and the 5950X is $750 or more, the cost of those really isn't justified for the vast majority of users. You need a very specific workload to make them a valid recommendation over the 12700K, for example. The integrated graphics on this CPU, although we haven't really explored it in this review, they are also a bonus for a lot of tasks, in particular for video editing and transcoding. The integrated graphics actually use Intel QuickSync, which accelerates some of those transcodes. It depends on codec, but it's something that's worthwhile to have around, and it's another reason to recommend this CPU for productivity and particularly video editing style tasks. Looking at the rest of the lineup, we can see from other testing that the i5-12600K at $300 is an incredibly strong gaming CPU. It's got very high single core performance, it's just got 6 P cores and 4 E cores. And again, even if you need to do video editing and your budget is a little more restricted, that is a really valid choice for video editing or productivity systems, photo manipulation and that sort of thing, or indeed gaming. It's an absolutely fantastic CPU. And the only problem really going down to the i5 is just the cost of a relatively expensive Z690 motherboard, $200 or more. Whereas some of the AMD Ryzen options, you can get motherboards down to around $100, $150 that are full featured and will suit you really well. So it may be if you're on a tight budget, the Ryzen 5600X, for example, could make more sense. Moving up to the top of the current 12th generation product stack then, the justification for the i9-12900K, its only differences really are that it has 30 megabytes of level 3 cache, which can matter in some games and other cache dependent tasks, and a very slightly higher boost clock. It also has 8 E-cores instead of 4. However, the circumstances where that additional $200 spend is justifiable really are quite limited in the face of the performance of the i7-12700K. It's really a CPU that is again aimed at enthusiasts, content creators and productivity where time is critical or you really must just have the best, or simply people who do want the very best product and they want quite happy to pay for it. Well, that's fine, the i9 is there for those kind of consumers. But if cost is at all a consideration in your build, then we can, having tested this CPU, we can thoroughly recommend the i7-12700K at $400. It's an absolutely fantastic CPU and incredibly high performance. If AMD choose not to cut pricing on their CPUs at this point, they are left a little bit out in the cold. The 12700K beats the $400 5800X in pretty much every test, and the i5-12600K actually beats the 5800X in almost all testing, gaming and productivity, and offsets a little bit of the more expensive motherboards by being $100 cheaper at $300. AMD do have a response in the pipeline in early 2022. They've got stacked V-cache versions of the Zen 3 CPUs coming, and they will undoubtedly lift performance a little bit. How much exactly is yet to be seen. It will be interesting to see if they're able to compete with the 12th generation. However, for the time being, these remain the highest performing CPUs you can buy. What I would say is when you look at the results that we've presented here, if you're sitting on an Intel 10th generation or 11th generation system, or a Ryzen Zen 3 system, this is not a prompt for you to go out and upgrade. The actual real-world performance benefits of this platform is a good step forward, but it's not something that would be night and day if you upgrade from those CPUs. So we would advise you sit it out, wait for things like DDR5 to mature, operating systems to be optimized for this new kind of CPU, and there will be undoubtedly generations that build on the strength of this 12th generation that are even going to be even better value for money down the line. In conclusion then, it's been really nice to be pleasantly surprised by an Intel CPU. The i7-12700K comfortably beats the outgoing Intel flagships, and all of the CPUs from AMD's Ryzen line except the Ryzen 9 CPUs in very highly multi-threaded workloads. This generation has righted many of the wrongs of the 11th generation, that final dogged attempt to hang on to an aging architecture well past its prime. Power draw and temperature are back down to sensible levels, although they're not particularly low, and performance is outstanding. Whilst it often felt like pulling teeth getting performance out of the i9-11900K for example, the i7-12700K gives it up willingly, and often just impresses you with its performance across a wide range of tasks. This CPU does most things right. If you're looking to build a high-performance PC right now, then this or the 12600K are basically the right choice for you. It's just a case of finding that RAM and the motherboard to offset the costs a little bit and make sure that the platform itself offers good value. However, if these processors and the accompanying Z690 motherboards are a little bit expensive for you, keep an eye out. Early in 2022, we're going to see the launch of the non-K CPUs, and particularly the 12400 looks like it will be a very strong gaming CPU, and hopefully some more affordable B660 motherboards, which should take the sting out of the platform cost. On the evidence of these flagship CPUs, and given the dearth of budget options available from AMD at the moment, we should see Intel back in a dominant position in the gaming and enthusiast CPU market. It'll be interesting to see how AMD can respond to this, and they've got anything short of the upcoming Zen 4 platform that can help them retain their rightfully won section of the enthusiast CPU market through 2022. So then, the i7-12700K and the other CPUs in this Intel 12th generation lineup are really great CPUs and well worthy of your consideration if you're looking to build a PC now. I hope you found this video useful and informative. If you have, please click like and subscribe, then you'll get updates about our upcoming content. Please do also check out premiumbuilds.com. We've got loads of articles, advice, recommendations, all aimed at getting you the best possible PC for your money.